The reason I chose this topic is because, as we see in the field of trauma, which is my field, I often say to couples that couple intimacy is another casualty of trauma. It's a very, very common phenomenon, even in couples that are otherwise, have a pretty good relationship between themselves. I mean, they're not fighting. There's a lot of more general problems, of course, much more higher frequency in couples where one spouse was severely traumatized. There are generally more problems. But even in couples that are actually reasonably good couples and have good relationships, otherwise, sexual intimacy is a casualty of trauma, often even in those couples. So there's problems in that area. And for the second generation, I think it's particularly important to try and rethink our ways of being in this way and in this very important arena, because the other field of studies and knowledge that I would like to draw upon, not in this talk, but just letting you know, that when we look at studies of adult development, and there is one, for example, Harvard University has been leading a study that's one of the longest, if not the longest ever, about adult development. It's had I don't know how many directors already, as each of them, retires and the next one comes. The evidence from looking at what differentiates people who age better from people who age less well is quite clear about some things that are very important in protecting our sense of well-being, our mental sense of well-being, and even our physiological, physical well-being. And one of the most important things is that we have a very close relationship with at least somebody. And as I will try to say in the following presentation, you will see that in couples, in married couples, sexuality has a lot to do with the feeling of closeness in the couple. And while we are all here not exactly in the beginning of our sexual relationships or intimate relationship with our spouses, what we also see from neuroscience is that our emotions, our brains continuously change. We are creatures that are continuously changing through our experiences, especially our very meaningful experiences in relationships that mean a lot to us. Our actual brains change through those experiences. And in that way, we can be still, at this point in life, the architects of our experience. So the point is that even though, and in fact because we are all in midlife plus minus, I think that midlife, as I often say, is a very unique time in life. Just like adolescence is a very unique time in which there are a lot of reorganizations, I think a similar thing happens in midlife because there are so many dramatic changes. Just like in adolescence, all of a sudden you stop being a child and you're entering a completely different relationship with the world. You're expanding. You're expected to do different things. In midlife, there are a lot of changes that occur in terms of our relationship with our children. They are now adults. They moved away. They have their own families. Parents pass away. All kinds of things are happening. Our bodies are changing. Our minds are changing. We are much more able to see things from various perspectives at the same time, which younger people have less of an ability to do. And with that comes a certain capacity for what we call wisdom, a certain capacity for more tolerance for the perspective of the other, for the validity or possibility that there are other perspectives to the same thing, which allows a different dialogue between spouses, hopefully. that's the preamble to my talk. And I will have to say, I was, I tried to remain very much within the boundaries of what my understanding is of tzniut and modesty, but at the same time, that's another last comment before I start, I think that modesty is not to be confused with ignorance. Modesty should mean that we talk about certain very, very sensitive topics with great respect and with great sensitivity, but we have to talk about certain things, because I can tell you that I have a lot of couples that come from the very Orthodox communities. I had a patient who came to me for the first time last week. She's 38 years old. She has 7 children. She said in the first year and a half of their marriage, she couldn't get pregnant because they thought that just lying next to each other is what makes children. And as soon as they realized it, she immediately got pregnant. I have another boy who tells me that because he was waking up in the morning as an adolescent with the physiologically natural state of affairs in the body, in the male body, he thought that it's terrible, and he would punish himself terribly in all kinds of fasting and all kinds of things because he thought that he was bad. So modesty is not the same as ignorance, and I think we need to be able to talk about those things a little bit, and you chose to talk about them, so here we go. So the typical complaints that you hear when you work with couples who have sexual problems: I'm so sick of always having to initiate, but if I didn't, we'd never have sex. That's a typical complaint in many couples, mostly more often expressed by the men, but also in some couples, definitely it's the wife who has the higher sexual desire and the man who is not interested. I think my husband might be gay, his interest in sex is so low. Okay, I don't think she's attracted to me anymore, maybe she's having an affair, he's mean to me or ignores me all day, and then he expects me to jump into bed with him that night. He or she is too tentative, too rough, too slow, too fast, too talkative, not talkative enough. He's too focused on himself. All of these are typical complaints that you hear. What are some of the, by the way, we will go I'll try to go at a decent pace. If we don't complete what I have today, then I'll just move it to the next meeting and we'll continue then. What are some of the sources for dissatisfaction in this area of the relationship? So we have complaints about the frequency and about low desire, and we have complaints about the quality of the experience itself, whether it's exciting enough or satisfying enough or it feels connected enough. And what is very, very important to know is that sexual difficulties between partners can be very, very hurtful and very, very damaging to their own individual sense of self. I have a beautiful girl, 40 years old, who's just gotten married 2 years ago to a nice man, but they have a serious problem between them. She's a pretty, pretty girl. She said to me, I'm beginning to feel like not me. I'm beginning to feel like not pretty, not attractive, not even, my self-esteem is going down to my insecurities of middle school. I haven't felt so insecure since middle school because there's really an issue of sexual disinterest on the part of her husband. So it can be very damaging to either partners and also to the couple relationship. Sexual problems are actually very, very common in couples, and despite the difficulties that talking about it poses, both for couples and for therapists. I have a lot of patients that come to me who have been in previous therapies where even though they had issues, serious issues, it was not really ever talked about because, we all have our own templates, therapists as well. How comfortable are we talking about it will influence whether we will pick up on this topic or we'll sort of go around it. It is very, very important that we will talk about it because we can actually impact people to change at any time. And if we change that arena, we have an actual real possibility of creating a new level of intimacy in the couple, which, like I said, if you're at this point in life, your children are grown already, who is the most important source of support that you have? It's your spouse. And if intimacy increases in the couple, then it's a very important positive source of support for the current time and for the later years. So it is very hard to talk about sex, and in many, many couples, there's at least one partner that had been quite unhappy with the state of affairs, but had never done anything about it. So I have a couple that I'm seeing who are not frum, and they came to me. They're 70 years old both. They've been married since he was, since they were, there's a 1 year difference between them. So 20 and 21, they were each other's first kind of sweetheart. They got married. They had a good marriage. She thought they had a wonderful marriage. Everything was fine. He was very successful for a while in some career that took him on a lot of trips. She never suspected him. Everything was fine until 2 years ago. She found out that he actually had an affair with somebody 30 years ago. So she said the 30 years ago affair she could have dealt with, but she couldn't have dealt with the fact that for the last 30 years they actually maintained, she lives in England, the other woman, and they maintained connection, sort of a little bit of a flirty connection, never met, she believes that they never met, but this flirty connection over 30 years and all kinds of things, and that really upset her. Why am I bringing this up? Because only in the context of this happening and blowing up and nearly blowing up not just the marriage, but imagine the entire sense of this woman's life, what her life was about. Only in this context were they finally able to begin to talk about some of the things that they actually both were dissatisfied about in terms of their intimate relationship, but they never dared to talk about it. Now that this almost blew up and everything, and we're dealing with so much pain and so much damage, but we are actually, all of a sudden, they actually can have a much better connection in those ways than they had for all those years. And I just think, what a shame. What a shame. So in some cases, what happens, why people don't talk about it, is the belief that a lot of people have and maintain into our midlife, that sex should just happen naturally, and we don't have to put an effort into it, we don't have to have much discussion. I already talked about modesty, but just this idea that it should just happen spontaneously, naturally, we don't need to talk about it. That is actually a misconception, which I will probably mention a couple of times later on. One of the most important things for people our age and a lot younger even to begin to understand is that in long-term relationships in couples, we have to accept the loss of that idea, that sex will be this just kind of spontaneous eruption of desire on both sides at the same time, in a, as I said, in a spontaneous way. That does not happen in long-term relationships. And the sooner we understand that that's not something that we should expect in long-term relationship, the better we will be able to actually plan for the right circumstances, when it's a suitable time for both partners, and create the conditions that are conducive for it. But right now, back to why it's hard to talk about sex. Most people have not been raised to talk about it. Some people have never talked about it in their families and have never heard any talking about it in their families. And many are very afraid of feeling rejected, hurt. They're anxious about talking about it. It's not comfortable for them. Some of the main areas of sexual problems are, as I said already, asexual marriages. So sexual marriages in which there is very, very little sex. And as you will see in one of the next slides, we have an arbitrary definition in family therapy, in couple therapy. We have an arbitrary definition of what we consider an asexual marriage. So an asexual marriage, by our arbitrary definition, is a marriage in which sex occurs less than 10 times a year. We consider that an asexual marriage. So that is one area of a lot of problems because of sexual dysfunction, because of all kinds of other reasons that make for sexless marriages, and the frequency of it is quite high in the United States, actually, as you will see. And the other area of problems in sexuality in marriages is infidelity, real or virtual extramarital sex, affairs, and addiction. So real is obvious, you know, you have an affair with somebody. Virtual is all those other things that have to do with internet sex, with chat rooms, with porn, with sexual paraphilias, and all kinds of things like that. Inhibited sexual desire, ISD as we call it, is one of the main causes for asexual marriages. It's when one partner just kind of loses their sexual desire. It's the wife who says to me, you know, if I never had sex ever again in my life, it would be just fine with me. Or the husband, and I'll give you an example because I also see husbands who are like that. And because of the nature of intimate relationships, it's much more problematic when the spouse who is suffering from or expressing inhibited sexual desire, if it's the man, it's much, much more problematic. So it's a common problem in the United States. As you will see, it's reported by 1 out of 3 women. That's very, very high, very high. And 1 out of 7 men. So a little bit less, but still, this is a very high percentage. And like I said, by the arbitrary criterion of less than 10 times a year, 20% of married couples in the United States are considered asexual couples. The longer the problem is allowed to go on, the more problematic it is and the more difficult it is to try and change it. People become very awkward with each other, very uncomfortable. I had a couple that I will tell you about a little bit later, E and M, let's call them, who came to me and said that they had not been intimate with each other for, they weren't sure if it was 5 or 6 years. And when we started working on it, they were unbelievably awkward with each other. It was they not only had they not been intimate with each other, but they were like roommates that share a bed. They slept in the same bed, but they didn't touch, they didn't hug, they didn't snuggle, they didn't do any of that. And to restart this after 5 or 6 years of just kind of each getting into their side of the bed and giving each other a good night kiss, a peck, and going to sleep was very, very awkward. And it was, you know, people are so uncomfortable and so that, for example, when we started working on it and we got to the point, it's not right away, but when I got to the point where I said, okay, you know, we need to do such and such. I need you to be, to make time to actually be close with each other physically, not yet intimate, but, and we'll talk, I will actually, if you want, I will get later on, I left it as something that's in the end and that I will ask you if you want, I will tell you what exactly is one of the behavioral models that we use in couples to reintroduce intimate relationships, or to what we call revitalizing asexual marriages. So I can actually go with you specifically and look at what we do. But in one of the early phases, after we talked a lot about the relational stuff, and we got there, and I said, I want you to make time to really lie close to each other for a while and just be physically close. I got the dog is sleeping between us. So, and that's not the first couple, mind you. I have heard the dog issue many times. The dog sleeps between us. Yeah, it's very hard to be together when the dog, big dog or small dog, doesn't matter, sleeps between them. So the dog had to be banished to another room. There was a whole thing to work on to get them to be ready for that. Then once the dog was banished, the other thing that I heard was, well, the mattress, after 5 or 6 years of this, the mattress has like, you know, a mountain ridge in the middle. So there is her valley and his valley and a mountain ridge in between. Now, these are very intelligent people, very affluent people. They could go and get a new mattress anytime, right? But, okay. So, but what am I saying? It becomes very awkward, and we have to be able to gently and persistently go through the awkward phase nonetheless. So what you should know, again, just to support what I said before, is that the impact of sex on marital satisfaction is enormous. So in good marriages, when sex is good, and then we ask people about all kinds of aspects of their relationships, and we calculate, we find that good sex is considered by people who have it to be to contribute between 15 and 20% to their sense of why they're feeling so good about their marriage, their vitality, their satisfaction. It energizes their bond. They say about 15 to 20%. But when it's not functioning well, it contributes between 50 and 70% to people's sense of loneliness and dissatisfaction and resentments and hurt and all kinds of other negative feelings, mutual negative feelings about the level of intimacy or lack of it in the couple. So a non-sexual marriage is a real major threat to marital satisfaction and viability, and, as I said before, to our own sense of viability and self-esteem and all of those things. One issue that is an inherent issue in marriages is the clash, if you like, between two very important forces. The area or the need for security in relationships, and and everything we put under eros, which is the need for novelty, the need for excitement, the need for renewal, the need for different things. We are very, very much rewarded in our brain for novelty. Novelty releases dopamine in our brain, and it makes us feel good when things are new, when things are different. It just kind of boosts our good feeling. When something is the same, you know, familiarity breeds contempt, goes the English expression, right, in English? And there are such expressions in almost every language that I know, at least. So we have the need to feel secure in a relationship, to feel well known, to feel accepted, to have predictability, to know that this is our home, that this is where we belong. Those are attachment needs. And then, on the other hand, we have the need as human beings for novelty and excitement and adventure, and especially you know, in the realm of sexual behavior and sexual the human sexual repertory, we are much more easily excited by novelty. So these two needs actually could be inversely related. So we have an existential problem there of these two things clashing. And what is very, very important is, like I said in the very beginning, we have to come to some kind of an integration within ourselves where we can accept that that sex the way it was when we were very young and in the very, very beginning of the relationships, if we were lucky enough, by the way, that it was really, really good then, and that's not the case for everybody. Some people started in a not so good place, were very inexperienced and ignorant and uncomfortable with their sexuality and never had great sex when they were young. But even for those who did, one has to come to a place where one accepts that grown-up sex, as I call it, grown-up sex in long-term relationships is different. It's more about really other things than about that spontaneous, fiery kind of a thing that was then before. So what is very, very important, and what we'll talk a little bit more about, is we must understand, in order to be able to actually work towards good grown-up sex, understand what it requires and what prevents us from it and what were the issues and what we need to make better. We first of all have to understand our emotional dowry, our nedunya, what we brought with us from our past into our relationship. So in terms of the integration, let me just say another few words about that integration between, on one hand, accepting simply that yes, there is a certain loss that we have to accept, that grown-up sex in long-term relationship will not have the excitement of novelty, of new things, but we can bring excitement into it nonetheless in other ways, because novelty does not necessarily mean only a new person. It means a lot of things that we can do with the same person within the relationship. For example, increasing the level of emotional intimacy and vulnerability between the couples, changing something quite meaningful in the way that we relate, changes dramatically the way people feel about each other in terms of their wish for physical intimacy. So what do I mean? Even if you think about the dialogue that I taught you, the sitting, when we all of a sudden, who was here when I talked about the dialogue? Just a few people? Yeah, a few people. So when I said, that if we have to have a very heart-to-heart and a very thought-out conversation with our partner, that we really want to go in the best way, I suggested that we even sit in a certain way, right, on two equal chairs. This is a good closeness, like really close. And if it's my partner, then I would even hold hands. And I would be at exactly this distance. If you need to, you can put a pillow behind. Why? Because we know that at this distance, the activation of the brain, of each other's brain, is better than when it's further away and in a different, we look at each other's eyes. And what I see often in my office when I use this method is, first of all, people will actually say, I haven't looked in your eyes like this for 15 years. We live next to the other person and we lose that sanctity of the closeness, of the actual relating to them as a person that we actually want to know and want to know on a much deeper level. Once this happens, very often, once we increase that level of intimacy, very often, this is novel enough for our brain. This is like, oh, this is new. And now we talk about things that we never talked about before. It's very new. That's exciting enough for our brain sometimes to kick it into a very different space in terms of also the attraction and the vitality that is inserted into, or the excitement that is inserted into the sexual arena. Outside the bedroom, if we want to somehow infuse excitement into the relationship, outside the bedroom is very important to maintain some kind of separateness. I have a patient who's very, very, he's very sweet. very nice man. And he said, you know, my wife has a sense that we should be so close that there's no problem for me to see when she shaves her legs, when she flosses her teeth. I don't need to see it. I really don't need these images. You know, so for him, what he's saying is that if he is to maintain some sort of an erotic otherness, you know, we need some space. The other has to remain somehow a little bit other. For some people it works. They can stay together in the bathroom, floss their teeth, and feel very excited about each other nonetheless. For him, it's not exciting. He does not want these images. Those are types of things that we actually need to talk about. And when we talk about these things in a couple, it's very important that it's not like, what do you mean? Why can't I floss my teeth next to you? On that level of fighting with the other person, yeah, you can say, are you out of your mind? This is ridiculous. We're married for, 20 years already. Why can't I? What is this? Or you can actually really open your mind to saying, the other person is actually trying to tell me what are turn-offs for him and what he needs in order to maintain in the closeness that we have. Just enough otherness, just enough individuality and separation to maintain erotic attraction. So we have to be open to it. That's in terms of outside the bedroom. So also in terms of maintaining some interests of your own, some aspects of yourself that are not completely merged. Because if we completely merge and become one, then there's not enough separation there to be attracted to the other person. We just become one, but one is not a couple. One is not, there isn't enough space there for erotic attraction. Inside the bedroom, sex is a paradoxical activity that requires both, on one hand, the capacity to sort of stop thinking about taking care of the other person and being able to allow yourself occasionally this kind of surrender into self-immersion into your own experience of your own sexuality, and at the same time also being attentive and attuned to what the other person needs. And it's very important that there'll be a certain dance between these two states, being able to be completely sort of abandon yourself to your own stuff and not be continuously worried about the other. Is it good for the other? Am I doing it right for you? Is this good enough? Is it too slow? Is it too fast? But at the same time, to also be attentive. Another issue that is maybe an issue of our generation more, this is a beautiful article that you can read online that was on in the New York Time magazine a while ago. I had my students read it. It was about whether being more equal now, the genders in their roles in a marriage, actually works against good sex. It's an interesting premise. I won't go too much into it, but it's another thing to think about, that we have to figure out, we have to talk about it. There is no right or wrong. What I mean is that there are a lot of issues in the relationship that might interfere or interact with how good sex is, and we have to talk about it. If you don't think that it's sexy for you when your husband cooks with you or bakes, well, it's something to talk about. Okay, so some of the, just a short rundown of causes of sexual difficulties. Of course, there are oftentimes physiological factors, especially as we age, especially male sexuality after 50 is not male sexuality at 20 or at 30, and the first thing that I do when people come to me and describe low sexual desire in a couple on the part of the male, the first thing I do is I ask the man to go to his internist physician and check all the relevant parameters, testosterone levels, and other things, just to make sure that that is not the issue. Of course, there are other physical and mental conditions that can interfere. Medications can interfere in a major way. Various types of medications for various conditions that people take. Sleep deprivation is not good for sex. Alcohol and drugs are often very not good. Hormonal problems, this is why I send people to be examined, both men and women. All kinds of illnesses interfere very, very directly. So all of that has to be, first of all, examined so that people don't feel like there's something wrong with them, or the spouse feels there's something wrong with them, but really it's the diabetes or something else that is making it. And we have to work with it differently if the cause is physiological. There are, of course, environmental or lifestyle factors such as lack of time, lack of energy, lack of space, lack of privacy, all of those things. Then there are psychological and emotional factors. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And all of these things are often interrelated. So a few other contributing factors that people don't often think about in terms of sexual difficulties. I see a lot of issues that go along with ADD. When someone is a little ADD, it's sometimes very difficult for them to be attuned to the cues, the subtle cues that the other person gives, especially in sexual behavior, or to be more patient with them. Insomnia we talked about. Another problem that is big and relatively simple to solve in long-term relationships is that many times people have very different sleep cycles. She's a night owl and he's an early riser. So she doesn't like to have sex in the morning because that's when she's finally asleep and she likes to be left alone, but she doesn't want to come to bed early either. So when are we going to do that? So it's really important to actually look at these things and not see them as mutual rejection, because often the husband who goes to bed and the wife who wants to stay up, he takes it as a rejection. She doesn't want to come with me. And he's absolutely right. If she doesn't actually make an effort to say, let's talk about it, and here are the times when we will actually make the time to be together, then it won't happen. And then it is indeed a problem. The dog in the bedroom, of course, we talked about. And of course, a history of previous relationship injuries. For those people who had previous relationships, like a previous marriage that was very hurtful, where they were very put down, where they were told by their spouse that they're unattractive, or they felt unattractive, or they were mistreated in some way in the sexual arena. These are very painful experiences that we bring with us to later relationships. So in terms of the psychological and the emotional causes, I want to talk about this a little bit also specifically in relationship to the second generation, if you think about it, about some of the topics we touched upon in all of the previous meetings. But let's start with just a couple of bullets. Shame about one's own body interferes tremendously with the ability to be sexual and to enjoy sexuality. It's a great shame, though, in terms of the fact that most of us, past a certain point in life, don't look exactly like Brad Pitt or Angelina Jolie at their peak, right? Most of us don't look like this, and still we can have a very gratifying sexual relationship with our spouse, but oftentimes it's our own feeling about our own body and its flaws at some point in life that interferes with it, even if our spouse is very happy with it. So that's something to work on. Shame about one's sexual prowess or performance is a big, big deal. Especially, it's especially a problem that interferes with male sexuality and the ability to perform. Will I be able to? Will I not? Especially if there was a time when it didn't go so well, it can immediately then snowball from there didn't work. Will it work this time? The more anxious you become about it, it won't happen, you know. So it's very, very important to understand, and I think I put some percentages there. I actually wanted to give you a sense of realistic percentages as to what percent of the time people actually say that it was as satisfying for both. It's a certain percent of the time. Most of the time, there's a big chunk of time when somebody says it was great for one and it was okay for the other one, and that's okay too. And sometimes there is a certain percent for people who are in even younger than midlife. There is like between 5 to 15% of times when spouses have sex and it's just not good. It just didn't go well, or it was a total failure. And what's very, very important is to get on the horse right after that, not to make it into a, wow, that was a really bad time, and now we're really anxious about the next time, and we'll put it off, and we're really anxious about it. It's very important to be able to use some humor, some playfulness, and just kind of, like I sometimes say when this happens, I say, go have some bad sex. You know, be a little lighter about it, sort of accept that like everything else, it can't always be perfect. Accept that it's okay and nothing terrible will happen if you just try to deal with that. So what I said about arousal can come after a decision to have sex, or at least after a decision to maybe have it. That's very, very important in terms of what I said about grown-up sex. We are we're busy, we're older, we're not going to have that fiery lightning thing that might be part of the younger years. So what we have to accept is that we have to make the right conditions be there. We have to create the circumstances. If she's a night owl and he's an early riser, we have to talk about it and decide that on Friday night and on I don't know what other, that's our evening to actually be together, or our midday to be together, or whichever time actually works best for the two. One can actually talk about which is the best time and plan for a time that the phones will be off, that it's likely to be without interruption, that we're both going to be in the right kind of state of mind, and that it's going to be at least possible to do it. And maybe you'll get into the mood. And maybe as you're sort of making it possible, maybe you'll get into it as you're doing it. The cat and the mouse pattern is a very important thing to bring to people's attention. It often looks, as I described it here, he pursues her sexually in ways that are consistently not arousing to her or are ineffective in seducing her, yet he continues them anyway. So, for example, often it happens in such a way where the husband, let's say, makes a lot of sexual comments during the day, and the wife actually finds it, and for him it's like a sexy thing that builds up anticipation, and for her it's not at all. She needs a certain sort of ambiguity about, let's see if it will happen or will not happen. It's not, she says, comments about, let's say Sunday afternoon is their time to be together. And he makes a lot of comments about it. And she begins to feel like it's just too scheduled, too predictable, too much like yet another activity that's on the agenda. Yes, which begins to be not quite so exciting for her. So anything that one partner continues to do, even though it's not effective, but he still continues to do it, while she tries to avoid or elude him in various ways, such as coming to bed late, avoiding undressing in front of him, picking fights before bedtime. We have a lot of common techniques that we all came upon when we want to avoid certain things, and so she does that. She blames her lack of sexual interest on him or on situational factors, and does not really want to look at anything to do with her feelings about sexuality or her own sexual history. His constant sexual pursuit and his lack of recognition or understanding of her experience leaves her feeling used. All he wants is to kind of use me for his sexual release. It's not really about me, what I feel. So she feels used, as if he's not paying attention to her cues. It doesn't matter to him what turns her on. It doesn't matter to him what turns her off. He's not paying attention. It's not really about her. It's just about his sexual desire and need to release it. He, on the other hand, feels constantly rejected, and her avoidance of him leaves him feeling very hurt, undesired, unloved, and so on. But usually what happens, and this is where we go to the next topic, which is how to talk about it. What happens is that people's mutual hurts, especially about sex, because sex is such a sensitive issue, we usually either not talk about it because it's too difficult, as I said in the beginning, or when we already say something, we always say it in anger. It's easier to say it in anger and express frustration and anger than to express the deeper, more vulnerable feeling underneath. Like, when you always make me initiate and you never initiate, I feel unloved, undesired, unattractive. But to say it not as a blow to the other person, but actually as revealing your own vulnerability. So obviously we each bring our templates. We talked about our templates a lot in this series of lectures. We talked a lot about the fact that we each are a product of how we experienced our environment growing up. It doesn't mean that our parents were like this or like that. It means how they were in our experience. And as we talked about in the meeting where we talked about siblings, what we see very clearly in sibling research is that the same, people who have the same parents can often have a completely different view. It's as if they describe completely different parents and have a very different relationship with them, and have, as a result, very different experiences of how to relate in intimate relationships. But we each have our templates, which we bring to our relationship, which are automatic ways of relating. If we were very lonely in our home, we may bring a template to our future relationships where we are always lonely. We always feel lonely, and when we always feel lonely, we actually, today, I had a patient who just had his 70th birthday, a physician. He has lived his entire life, including an unsuccessful marriage, very, very lonely. But today, in a session, and I won't really bore you with that, but today he came to me and he said, I had an epiphany. Something happened that very clearly, something happened over the last week that very clearly showed him how he keeps himself lonely. He doesn't allow himself to be close enough, vulnerable enough, show enough of what he really is to other people, even people who show that they are a little bit interested in him. He doesn't allow it, and as a result, he indeed reenacts and reinforces the fact that he is very alone and very lonely. Now, we can do that within a marriage too. If we feel very lonely, we've always been lonely, nobody actually really cared to know what we really feel inside, we were hurt, being close to people was very hurtful, we can bring that template into our relationship and we can actually make it be true even if our spouse is not like that. Because what we need to learn is not only to give, what we want to give the other person. But another part of important part of growing up and changing is to learn to get what we want to get. It's not so easy sometimes to allow ourselves to accept that which we really, really long for, because if we didn't get it for a long time, then we developed some very powerful ways to defend ourselves and to say either I don't need it, I can do without it, or other ways of shutting it out so as not to feel continuously the pain of longing for it. However, as I'm looking at the room here and I'm seeing people who are mostly in midlife, I guess we all have to come at this point, and I think this is one of the other things why midlife is such a good time to change. First of all, we're no longer so busy with some of the other tasks that we were so busy with before. The raising of the children, the career, the building of the family, all of that. That is behind us for the most part. And second, we actually recognize that our time is limited. We have come to a point, it's like one of my professors said it at one point when I was very, very young. He said, there comes a point where we realize that the time left ahead of us is probably shorter than the time behind us. And that is a very poignant recognition. And with that recognition, we can do something very good, because we can say to ourselves, this is what's left, and I'm going to make the best of it. And with the strength that we've acquired all those years, and with the achievements that we have to rely on, we can actually say, you know what? We are the architects of our experience. If we recognize our templates and what we bring to the here and now, then we can change it. And as we change the way that we relate, our templates change also. So, we also, one other thing about our templates is we are very creative beings, people, and therefore sometimes we can have templates that are fantasy templates. Like my patient Lisa had a very, very disturbed Holocaust survivor mother, very disturbed. And the father was out of the picture because she divorced him. He was really very psychotic, what today we would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder with psychotic symptoms. At the time, all of them were diagnosed as schizophrenics, as paranoid schizophrenics. She divorced him. There was a second husband who was very mean to my patient. It was a very difficult house. But she did what André Green, is a very famous psychoanalyst, wrote a book about. He called it the dead mother, and he didn't mean a mother who's really dead, but a mother who's emotionally unavailable, the dead mother, unresponsive, unattuned for the child. And he said there, some children, like my patient Lisa, see what they see, and they decide to do the opposite. And that helps them create a much more functional way of relating later on in life. From the thing that they actually experience or observe, they decide to do the opposite. Or they fantasize, if you like, a very different template that they never experienced, and that's what they orient themselves according to. This can be very adaptive, and like my patient Lisa, she did that, and she did that quite successfully. Or another thing, though, to remember, sometimes we have a template, like we were very lonely, and we were not treated well in our family, and it was very difficult. And we created a template, an idealized template, that our spouse, when we find them, that person will love us completely and will never upset us and will understand us always, 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 and will do what we need always, always, always. And you know, there is no such thing. So sometimes the idealized template can be a problem, And we have to say, okay, it's great that you created this other view. There's a lot of good in it. But, you know, maybe we have to take it down a notch or two and make room for the fact that in reality, this other person is not going to be, they might be a lot more functional and loving than what you experience, but it's not going to be perfect. So the goal, as I said, is to come to a relatedness that is much more functional than what was experienced, but also realistic. To tie it back to the second generation issues in particular, and only one slide in this talk, because actually I really want to stay very much focused on the issue of sexual problems, but just to remind you that some of the main issues of the second generation, as we talked about it at great length, include, for example, an inordinate concern about the emotional needs of the other, to the point that a lot of children of survivors, especially women, have a really hard time connecting with their own needs. It's really hard for them. They're not used to thinking about their own needs. They're always used to thinking about everybody else. As you will see when I become a little more specific with regards to the sexual stuff, it's very important for us to be able to connect with our own needs, with our own sensations, with our own what turns us off, what turns us on, or all of those feelings in the body as well as emotional and psychological things. We have to first of all be able to connect with ourselves if we are to be able to connect with the other person in a good way sexually. Otherwise, we're just like there expecting the other person to work a miracle. And that doesn't tend to happen. Okay? So we have to help, you know, by the way, a movie that some of you, if you watch movies, might find educational in terms of some of the exercises that I will tell you about afterwards, about how we work with couples. The movie is showing that in a nice way. It's a movie with Meryl Streep and what's his name, I forget. It's called Hope Springs. And I think it's a worthwhile movie to watch in this context. So we have to establish a connection with our own feelings. We can't be all overly concerned only about the other person to the extent of not feeling ourselves. Experiences of lack of attunement, lack of emotional availability are very common in the memories of second generation, even when our parents were very good parents, very loving parents, but very giving parents who were very focused on providing for us and making sure we're safe and that we have everything we need, and really loving parents, but still post-traumatic residues are by nature something that interferes greatly with the other person's ability to be very emotionally attuned to many things in the relationship with growing children. So we see that as a big theme, as I discussed with you, in adult children of survivors describing their childhoods. So when we have a lot of that left inside, that we were not well attuned to, that there was lack of emotional availability, all of those things, we have adapted to it. Remember the statues that I showed you? We have adapted to it in some way. Either, again, we became self-sufficient, we don't need anybody, or we became too clingy because that was a way in which we somehow found it somewhere else or whatever. And we carry with us certain very deep organizing principles, as we call it. A feeling that, oh, the other person will never understand me, or what I really feel doesn't really matter, or as soon as I'll upset the other person, then their needs come first. Or we have all kinds of things like that we carry with us. They don't really, as soon as it upsets, as she gets upset, she doesn't care about me. All kinds of things like that, which we have to begin to be aware of if we are to finally sort out the present from the past and lay the past to rest and do something better and different. We have what, if you recall, I talked with you about the fact that we say, based on all of the stuff that we see in the second generation, we talk about a failed intersubjectivity. So a sense that the children had often that they're not really understood by their parents, and that they can't be understood. They can't talk to their parents about their needs. They can't really be understood. Why do I want to go sleep over at Nechama? Why do you need to sleep over? What's wrong? Why can't you just play and come back to sleep here? Well, to explain what is the meaning of sleeping there, that other kids do it, why is it special, why does it change the relationship, you couldn't talk about it, and those types of things sank in as when I need something, I can't talk about it. Nobody will listen to me. My wife will not listen. She won't understand. It becomes a habit. It becomes a certain belief about relationships. So we have to become aware of it, because if we are to talk about sex, which is so difficult anyway to do, and if it comes on top of this type of belief, then it can be very difficult to actually have the type of open conversation that we need to have. I am sure that I will not get through all the material that I wanted to today. It's actually almost by plan, because as I said, I started with the more general topics, going more and more specific as it progresses, and I wanted to check with you if that's okay with you, and if that's something that you would be okay with hearing. So that's good. And I also plan to leave some time at the end of the 10th meeting just for us to discuss the experience, what you got from it, how you feel about it, what you want me to know, and so forth. And there'll be room for a lot of questions and whatever you want then. So what are the benefits of good sex? The benefits of good sex are what we call self-object needs being met. Self-object needs in psychology, in the psychology the way I practice it, means that all of us, until the day we die, in order to sustain a good sense of self, good feelings of self-esteem and self-worth, feeling vital, feeling worthy, feeling like we're a good person, feeling like we, all of those good things that we want to feel about ourselves are sustained by other people and other things that are very meaningful to us, and with whom we have this kind of a sustaining relationship throughout life. It's not a dependency. It's that we are social beings throughout our lives, and we don't develop only from dependency to autonomy. Yes, we develop from dependency to autonomy in some senses, but on another path, we always remain part of a fabric of relationships, and what changes with time is the type of those relationships, from very immature relationships to mature relationships. Immature relationships are the relationships where we barely recognize the other person as another person, very narcissistic relationships in which you exist only in the ways that I need you to do all kinds of things for me, and I barely recognize you as another person. You're essentially a chanut makolet, a grocery store in which I get all kinds of things that I need. Mature relationships are what Martin Buber described in his concept of I and thou, right? There is I and it, there is I and you, and there is I and thou. The highest level of relationship, which we hope to have with our spouses, is the I and thou, where we really recognize each other fully as two separate beings that have a right to have their own feelings, their own opinions, their own separateness, their own otherness, which in fact, just because it's that, it allows us to get all kinds of very important self-object needs met. Because if you are fully an other to me, someone that I fully recognize as a separate person, but you love me, then I am really being loved by another person for who I am. If you are just essentially an extension of myself, another arm that I have that does what I want it to do, then what does it mean that you love me? It's not really that another person loving me, it's just some kind of an extension of myself. So what we call self-object needs are those needs for affirmation, for confirmation, for validation, all of those things that we get when a real other that means a lot to us loves us. Yes? So we feel that we're desirable and attractive and wanted, and we feel like we're a good lover, and all of those things also contribute greatly to our sense of self-esteem, to our sense of vitality. You know, people who don't have sexual relationships with each other for many years often tell me, even though they might be 35 years old and they haven't had sex in 6 years, and they say, I feel like I'm an old person. Because somehow feeling desirable and having that very special connection with someone else, only this one special connection with this one special person, is a very important thing for our overall sense of vitality and of being fully alive. So also the other thing that we get when we have good intimate relationship with our spouse is it's very vitalizing or affect regulating. So for a lot of people, it's either very stimulating and very exciting, very enlivening. For other people, it's very soothing, it's very calming, they feel very nurtured. All kinds of things like that contribute to one's own regulating of stress. Yes? Of stress and of feeling really both vital, as I said, and soothed. And in terms of the couple relationship, the experience of doing something so unique, so special with this only one person, and sharing this very, very intimate activity in a fully, like I'll talk about how we would like to share it with that person, makes us feel very similar and very belonging to each other. Yes? So also a very important sense of merger in a good way. So when that doesn't happen, and when there's a discrepancy in sexual desire between the two spouses, a lot of times the main problem is that both partners have a really hard time understanding each other's experience. It's very hard for the low desire partner to understand why they're being chased like this all the time. Why does the other person want sex so much? And they often feel that it's not about them. It's just this other person has a high sexual need, and they just want it released all the time, and it's really not about me. It's really not about me. And the other one, the higher desire partner, often feels, of course, totally mind-boggled about why the other one doesn't want a little more, and feeling very rejected, undesirable, and all of those things. Hurt, of course, by it. The point where I want to stop for today, and where we'll go more in depth next time, is that what happens is often that there is a stabilization of the couple relationship on what I call this frustrating status quo. Meaning there are differences in the levels of desire, or either about the frequency or about how it's done and how satisfying or unsatisfying it is, but neither seems to wonder why. What might be behind the other person's frustrating or hurtful or rejecting behavior? They don't think about what might be the feeling that other person might be going through. And the more stereotyped, as I said, behavior is that the man wants more, the woman wants less. But there are many, many couples where the wife is the one who would like more and the husband not. There is a good book about it by Michelle Davis Weiner called The Sex-Starved Wife, about many of those marriages. The point is we have to shake that status quo, and we have to go below the level of that hurtful behavior, why do you do this, and I feel this way when you do that. We have to go to a different level of discourse that addresses the feelings, the deeper feelings underneath, those self-object needs, if you like, as I said before, that are not being met. I feel undesirable when you don't want to have sex with me for all this time. I feel like I'm undesirable. I feel like you don't like me. I feel that you are not attracted to me. I feel lost. I feel lonely. And we have to change the way that we talk about it. You remember when I said, when we talked about the dialogue, I said I always tell people when difficult things have to be talked about, they have to be talked about. There's no way around it. There are sometimes difficult things we need to talk about in couples. But especially when they are difficult and you really want your point to get across, it's your responsibility to say it in such a way that it will go easily into the other person's ear. If it goes in a hurtful way, they'll shut down. Especially in sex. When we have sexual discrepancies in desire, in the way that it's done, when people are not happy with the way it is, when we already get them to the point that we want them to actually have an open conversation, because only an open conversation can get us to where we want, where sex for the next several decades will be something connecting and revitalizing and affirming and reassuring against all the blows that age brings, you know, all the illnesses and the conditions and the losses that come with age. We need that to buffer us against it. But if we needed to get there, it will only get there with a very frank discussion. So the discussion has to become a discussion of what do I deeply feel about it? What am I longing for? What hurts me? Not what are you doing wrong? And not to say it in anger and in frustration, but exactly the opposite, especially because sex is the most sensitive topic for people to talk about. And everybody is extremely vulnerable to being injured by things that you might say, whether you meant them or didn't mean them. Everybody is vulnerable to feeling injured. What? You mean I'm not good enough of a lover? What? You don't like the way I touch? What? You don't like the way I do this? What do you mean? And it's a very, very sensitive topic. So this topic of all topics, we really have to coach people how to talk about, so that it will actually be conducive and not add injury to a very vulnerable situation. Okay, I guess I'll stop here today.